morning, everyone. I'm Jeana Wirtenberg, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 5th UN Prime Northeast Conference, Sustainable Development Goals, Transforming Business and Practice. First, I'd like to introduce Dean Lay, Professor and Dean of Rutgers Business School, we affectionately call RBS, to welcome you to the conference. You can read her complete bio in the Entity app, but let me say a few brief highlights. Dean Lay received her PhD in industrial engineering with a minor in computer sciences and has over 5 publications. She is a recipient of 5 Best Teacher Awards at RBS and was selected as one of the top 50 women in business by NJBiz. She chaired the Department of Supply Chain Management and Marketing Sciences, where the program grew to one of the top-ranked programs in the nation. Lay became Dean of RBS in 2015 and has led us to great distinction. And I might add, is a role model for what good leadership looks like and is an inspiration to work with every day. Dean Lay.
Thank you, Jeana. Thank you. So I'm very happy to see you, all of you, virtually. And thank you for joining us at this important event. As we all know, our world is facing many challenges, especially during this pandemic. Universities, students, corporations, NGOs, and our communities must work together towards the Union's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As a large public business school in the Northeast, one of our core missions is to greater social impact through our scholarly research that is highly relevant and that generates new insights into the development of business models and strategies that create shared value for all, and innovative academic programs that prepare diverse students to become the future workforce who are resilient, resourceful, responsible, and who are willing to invent themselves for the digital era. Rutgers Business School never stops in our drive to fulfill the mission, even amidst the pandemic. In addition to the high impact research and the conferences, such as this Prime Conference, our faculty have also been applying their business knowledge to help this community. For example, we helped convert several Newark-based small businesses into hand sanitizer factory and the production lines for making N95 face masks. Our faculty are also currently leading a major project for the New Jersey state for redesign and rebuilding its PPE supply chains. We strongly believe that creating shared value and a positive social impact is a key enabler to the long-term success and sustainability of companies. And to us, as a public business school, it ensures the long-term success, strength, and sustainability for us as well. Let me use this opportunity to send a special thank you to Professor Jeana Wirtenberg for her outstanding job in chairing the conference committee, and my many colleagues at RICSI, PPCP, and many other faculty and staff members at Rutgers Business School for their strong support to this important event. And again, to the speakers, panelists, and all the participants, thank you for being here with us at this important event, and my very best wishes to you all for a successful and productive conference starting today. Welcome. Back to you, Jeana.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dean Lay. So at this point, I have the great pleasure and honor and privilege to introduce Gary Cohen. I have had the privilege to work directly with Gary, who is the Executive Vice President of Global Health and President of the BD Foundation at Becton, Dickinson and Company, as he is the founder of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, RICSI. Gary is also a board director at UNICEF USA and the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, board co-chair of GBC Health, and board chair and founder of Together for Girls, a global partnership of national governments, UN agencies, and private sector organizations dedicated to stopping violence against children, particularly violence against girls. He presently serves as chair of the CDC Corporate Roundtable on Global Health Threats, holds undergrad and MBA degrees from Rutgers, and was named a Rutgers 250 Fellow in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Gary.
Well, thank you, Jeana. And I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's attending the Prime Conference. Jeana mentioned a little bit about my background, but I would say my primary role over the last nearly 40 years has been as an executive in a Fortune 200 company, Becton Dickinson, which is a very large medical technology company. But unlike most who pursue professional careers in the business sector, I made a decision some years ago to devote my professional career and much of my personal time towards positive societal impact. I was fortunate to be able to pursue this in a company that is truly a good company, that has a very strong purpose and works in healthcare. And also, I collaborated closely, as Jeana had mentioned, with UN agencies, non-government organizations, and nonprofits, including a nonprofit I founded in 2009, Together for Girls. Also, prior to the SDGs, and I'll speak about the Sustainable Development Goals or the global goals in a moment, but I had the opportunity to really engage in supporting the Millennium Development Goals, the predecessor to the SDGs. And there weren't many business people involved in supporting the MDGs because at that time, there wasn't really much of an expectation of engagement from the business sector. It was really oriented towards governments, civil society, and non-government organizations. The SDGs are completely different in this respect. When they were adopted by all member states of the United Nations in 2015, strong engagement of the business sector had been expected from the outset. And also the MDGs really focused on poverty and health in low resource countries, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals pertain to the whole world and all countries. So I would say that the expectations on the role of business and society are substantially changing, and not just because of this expectation of engagement in the SDGs. They're changing broadly. But I would also say we're still at an early phase of this trend. While it's at an early stage, though, I would say it's unstoppable. You know, I tell people I see the trend towards engagement of business in addressing societal needs and problems and issues as being like a diesel freight train. It's not moving at fast speed. It's not like the Shinkansen, the Japanese bullet train. It's moving at a steady pace, but it's unstoppable. And I think any companies or any sector that tries to get in the way of this trend of really trying to harness the impact of business, the capability, the resources, the skills of business to address societal needs, anyone who gets in the way of that trend probably does so at their own peril, including companies themselves. And as evidence of that, I would say just look what's happened over the last several years as more and more stakeholders, influential stakeholders, have gotten involved in this trend. So in 2018, the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, established expectations that companies fulfill a social purpose. And he repeated this expectation in his annual letter to shareholders in 2019 and 2020. In 2019, last year, the Business Roundtable moved away from its definition of the purpose of a corporation, moving away solely from focus on shareholder primacy to emphasize the need for commitment to all stakeholders. these pronouncements were not coming from sort of radical socialists, let's say. They were coming from within the core of the corporate sector. And the expectations that companies will enhance rather than harm society are coming from all corners. They're coming from investors, particularly through the ESG movement. They're coming from customers because people want to do business with good companies. They're coming from within, from a company's own employees. Increasingly, employees are less tolerant of companies that are not using their capability to do good in society. There are some companies that have gotten quite advanced at this. And I would say there's also emerging evidence that those companies that are more advanced are outperforming their peers, not just in social impact, but also in their performance as companies, their financial performance. Now, I had the thought that advanced companies also have gained substantial know-how on how to incorporate social purpose into their successful business models. And it was really, that was the basis why in 2018, I decided to work with Rutgers to found this new institute, the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, which we call RICSI for short, because I thought there was a real opportunity to integrate empirical evidence, empirical experiences from the most progressive companies into the academic curricula in business schools. And I thought that this would be particularly important for developing future generations of business leaders who would embed social impact and social purpose into their leadership agenda and strategies. Also, I saw an opportunity to incorporate this with existing business leaders by sharing best practices. Now, I chose the Rutgers Business School for a number of reasons. One is it has a very high level of academic excellence in its business curriculum. It's a very large school, so you can reach greater numbers of people. It has phenomenal diversity. The Rutgers Business School in Newark is among the most, in fact, Rutgers in general in Newark is among the most diverse college campuses in the United States. And that gives it access to it also provides access to top students who may not gain entry into Ivy League schools. And there's a lot of curricula in Ivy League schools, but not as many students have access to those schools. And I would say also undeniably, because I'm a double alum from Rutgers, that had an influence, but it was more so the characteristics of the business school as being a top school, very large and very diverse. From the outset, we've had very strong support from Dean Lay, from Professor Wirtenberg, from Jeana, from Professor Barnett, and we launched the RICSI and then recruited Noah Gaffney as its executive director. We've made substantial progress since its founding about 2 years ago, and I think you'll hear more about that during this conference. And it's appropriate that this conference specifically focuses on the SDGs because, as I mentioned, the SDGs are a strategic framework for addressing the most important needs and issues in society. And if we can harness the impact, the influence of the business sector to address these needs, we'll be able to advance them much further. And many of the needs can only be addressed by engaging the business sector. And I think that's what the United Nations member states realized when they opened the door, when the door became open for business at the United Nations with respect to the SDGs. Now, the goal of this Prime Conference to transform business education and practice in support of the SDGs couldn't be more important and timely, particularly given that the entire world now is engaged in a struggle to overcome a global pandemic that threatens both the lives and well-being of the world's population and also the world economy. So I very much look forward to the proceedings of this conference and the outcomes, and encourage you to further open the door through your work on business curriculum and education towards positive social impact, further open the door, widen the net of companies' involvement, and help instruct companies on how they can best engage using their capabilities to address the Sustainable Development Goals. Jeana, back to you.
Thank you, Gary, for your wonderful support. So as many of you may know, we actually started working on this conference about 2 years ago. And we're all set to go with a live conference on March 26th, 27th, 2020, when at the very last minute, we needed to cancel and postpone it till the fall due to COVID-19. I'll have to admit, I was very disappointed. However, the good news is that as a result, we now have expanded our reach to almost 6 times the original capacity and are able to include so many people from across the country and around the world. Incredibly, as of this morning, we have more than 900 people registered, from more than 60 countries and more than 33 states in the US. I can't read all the countries, but just to give you a sense, they're from every continent. We have people from Argentina, Australia, Austria, Bangladesh, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Croatia, Ecuador, Germany, Grenada, it goes on, India, Indonesia, it goes on and on, Nigeria, New Zealand, it's incredible. So welcome to the world. And in these few minutes, I want to give you a quick overview of the conference and let you know how best to engage with this amazing community that we have here. First, in terms of how to participate. One of my favorite quotes is from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." That's my request of you. We all talk about how we want things to be. Well, here's our chance to act consistent with our most cherished values. Some of these principles we live by at RBS Prime, and we invite you to do the same, are, number one, to be collaborative and synergistic, working across silos, being what we call multidisciplinary as well as transdisciplinary. Very important, being inclusive, as Gary talked about how diverse we are. So being inclusive of everyone. Let's not leave anyone out, as good solutions require collaboration and inclusion. We also see the Prime community as voluntary and self-organizing. We work both top-down with support from leadership, as you can see, as well as bottom-up with commitment from our faculty, staff, and students, all of whom are represented here. Importantly, we are action and goal-driven. We see ourselves as building bridges to the future, taking an appreciative approach, understanding where we are now, and building from there to where we want to be. We are socially conscious and compassionate for those who are less fortunate. We are courageous and willing to speak truth to power. We are open-minded and good listeners. We're curious, we're imaginative, and we're innovative. One other great quote I love is from Buckminster Fuller, 20th century inventor and visionary, who was so much ahead of his time. And he said, "You never change things by fighting against the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete." And that's exactly what we're doing here. Now let me say a few housekeeping notes about how best to navigate and participate in the content of the conference and get the most out of it. You all have been invited to participate in the Entigy app via an email that said, "Welcome to Sustainable Development Goals, Transforming Business Education and Practice." It came from the Entigy suite. I highly recommend that you create your profile and use Entigy to select and link to any or all of the sessions. We're excited to have 7 inspiring keynote speakers, more than 30 informative interactive sessions, an outstanding executive panel, an insightful and diverse student panel, and multiple facilitated student-oriented dialogue sessions. In light of the new AACSB standards on social impact, the conference is a great way to share, learn, and connect with others who are committed to social impact at universities around the US and across the world. When you click on schedule, you will see all 4 days, and by clicking on any particular session, you can learn more about it and also bookmark it. All the speakers are listed with their bios, and once you select your sessions, you will have your own unique program listed under My Event. You can also receive notifications from the conference organizers and see the list of attendees who have chosen to share their information. You can also send messages and images to registered conference participants. As a reminder, audience members' mics will be muted, but you can submit questions in the Q&A panel located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also feel free to chat, and we will be saving the chats. But if you have a question for the speaker, please post it in the Q&A. We also will be recording all the sessions and posting them in the coming weeks on our conference website, business.rutgers.edu/UNPRME. And if you have a Zoom-specific technical problem, please contact Zoom support directly. Okay, now everyone, let's rock the world. At this point, I'm delighted to introduce Dana Smith. Dana is the campaign director for Meatless Monday, the global movement which encourages people to cut meat from their diets one day a week for personal health and the health of the planet. Dana oversees the strategic vision for the global meatless movement. Previously, Dana helped launch and market the wildly successful online food store, Fresh Direct, and has a passion for all things culinary and a focus on food sustainability. Please join me in welcoming Dana.
Thank you so much, Jeana. You did a great job explaining Meatless Monday that I might have to ask you to be my spokesperson going forward. But thank you so much for having me. As Jeana said, my name is Dana Smith. I'm the campaign director for Meatless Monday, and I want to start off by saying happy Meatless Monday. I am thrilled to be here today. This is such a perfect opportunity to share with all of you how Meatless Monday supports and helps to achieve many of the sustainable development goals that you'll be focusing on throughout the Prime Conference. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the Meatless Monday movement. If this was any other year, I'd ask the audience to raise their hands and let me know if you've heard about Meatless Monday, and I could take the temperature of the audience. But maybe you can just do that as you're sitting at home or wherever you may be, and let me know if you've heard of the Meatless Monday movement. Since we have such a global audience, I'm hoping that the answer is yes. Meatless Monday is a global movement, and since it was founded in the year 2003, which is crazy that it's going on almost 18 years, it's been promoted in more than 40 countries, and the campaign and its messages have been translated in over 20 different languages. And the goal of our campaign is to encourage people to cut out meat from their diet one day a week. And we look at this for our personal health and the health of our planet. So many of you may have heard of our campaign through our popular hashtag, hashtag Meatless Monday. I encourage you to definitely go ahead and check it out and follow the hashtag and follow our accounts. Through that, we serve up incredible plant-based recipes, and we let people know the latest news on plant-based items and where they're being sold. And of course, we continue to promote the health and environmental benefits of cutting back on your meat intake. Or perhaps maybe you've heard of Meatless Monday through Oprah, Beyonce, Jamie Oliver. I mean, not to name drop or anything, but these are incredible people that also support our campaign. And I think that that's one of the pieces of the campaign that I personally love about Meatless Monday, is just that it's promoted and supported by chefs, restaurants, doctors, educators, city leaders, and celebrities around the world. And I just want to note that this happens organically. We don't pay or sponsor these people. They just believe in our message as much as we do and think that it's, an easy thing that they can get their audience and their followers on board with. I believe that people from all walks of life recognize the ease of the campaign. Okay, it's Monday, let me go meatless. And more importantly, the impact it has on our health and the planet. We believe it's a very easy first step everyone can take. Our campaign is backed in science and research from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And that research shows that eating less meat and more healthy plant-based foods can help reduce the incidence of chronic preventable diseases, preserve precious land and water resources, and combat climate change. it's still sort of alarming and kind of eye-opening that many people aren't aware or don't make the connection between what's on our fork and its impact on the environment. But conferences such as this one are so essential in educating people on this. For example, did you know that it takes 425 gallons of water, which is the equivalent to about 10 bathtubs filled with water? So just try to visualize that, 10 bathtubs filled with water to produce a quarter-pound burger. And that global livestock production creates more greenhouse gas than the entire transportation sector. But thankfully, Meatless Monday effectively addresses these issues by helping people in their everyday lives, with their friends, with their family, to shift their behavior and their diets. And the simple message works because it provides a regular cue, a weekly cue each Monday that leads to more plant-based eating throughout the rest of the week. Since Meatless Monday launched in 2003, it's grown through media, advocacy groups, and word of mouth. A recent survey showed that 42% of Americans were aware of Meatless Monday. And of those aware of Meatless Monday, 35% say the campaign has influenced their decision to not eat meat, cut back on meat, or consider cutting back on the amount of meat they eat. So in conclusion, the movement can be leveraged to achieve many of the SDGs that you'll be focusing on over the next couple of days. Meatless Monday and meat reduction help good health and well-being, support of local farmers, building sustainable communities, responsible consumption, and climate change. We are all in this together. As we go through the conference over the next few days, it will be great to think of ways in which meat reduction can play a part in meeting our SDG goals. And I just want to share with you one quick example of a community getting involved with Meatless Monday, which is right here in my backyard and many other people's backyard, knowing many of you are based in New York City. And through a concerted effort of passionate students, teachers, city leaders, and the likes in our community, Meatless Monday meals have been offered to over 1 million New York City public school students, as well as being offered in the public hospital system and the prison system. As they say, it takes a village. And now for the fun and delicious part before I sign off. In celebration of it being Meatless Monday, the Prime event is having a fun giveaway where 3 people will have the chance to win virtual conversations with leaders from this conference. You can find all the information on the Entigy app as well as the main website. You can click a red button that says Meatless Monday Initiative. And we are promoting today Master Chef James Corwell's peanut butter chocolate snack bar and asking you to get the ingredients and make it. It's super easy. Post it on social media, tag us, and we're going to pick 3 people to win. So you can find all that information on the app. And in closing, I just want to say that you can find out more information on Meatless Monday at our website, which is meatlessmonday.com. And our social media channels are a great place to follow us to find out, as I mentioned, all the latest plant-based news and why going meatless one day a week is really good and has a huge impact for your personal health and the health of the planet. So back to you, Jeana. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So everybody can go onto the app and see a whole section there on Meatless Monday. And I just want to say I'm participating. I have not been a vegetarian, but I'm starting today. And I invite you all to do that. And we can, just by virtue of that and our completely or almost completely carbon-free conference, we can make a difference starting today. Thank you. So we're right on time. And at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Stuart Hart, our first keynote speaker. Stuart Hart is a professor and Stephen Grossman Distinguished Fellow in Sustainable Business at the University of Vermont's Grossman School of Business. I have known Stuart for several decades, and his best-selling book, Capitalism at the Crossroads, was one of the first books I ever read when I got into the field of sustainability. It was selected by Cambridge University as one of the top 50 books on sustainability of all time. Stuart is one of the world's top authorities on the implications of environment and poverty for business strategy, and is one of the founding fathers of the base of the pyramid economic theory. He's founder and president of Enterprise for a Sustainable World, founder of the Base of the Pyramid Global Network, and a member of the Net Impact Board. He has published more than 100 papers and authored or edited 9 books. His article, Beyond Greening, Strategies for a Sustainable World, won the McKinsey Award for Best Article in HBR and helped launch the movement for corporate sustainability. He co-wrote with C.K. Prahalad the path-breaking article, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, which I totally remember reading and was mind blown. It really was transformational for me, which provided the first articulation of how business could profitably serve the needs of the 4 billion poor in the developing world. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Hart. Thank you.
I should probably try unmuting first. All right, there we go. Jeana, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today, all around the world. And let me just start with a little bit of a historical perspective before we launch on, I think what is the topic of the day, which is where are we headed, or where must we head from the standpoint of business education. And I promise I'll go into more depth around this idea of saddlebag sustainability. But to start, sort of reflect on my own career, my own time. I've spent the last 35 years in business schools as a faculty member, as a center director, and so forth. And it's roughly paralleled the time of shareholder primacy and market fundamentalism. It's essentially been, I've spent my time in business schools during that era, and have been involved in trying to at least be part of a counter narrative, which would take that on at some level, whether you think of it as sustainability or CSR or purpose or what have you. There's a growing counter narrative, I think, as we've already heard this morning, importantly so, to the point where business schools and particularly MBA programs have begun to sort of reach a tipping point, right? We see declining applications. Now, MBA is a declining category. And I think the pandemic only accelerates that. We can think of COVID as an accelerator, such that I believe we may be seeing the beginnings of the end of the age of shareholder primacy, and that this has major implications for business education, not just reactively, but proactively, since business education has been such an important part in driving shareholder primacy in the first place. So what I want to do is spend a few minutes kind of thinking about how we got here, the historical context of business education, because I think it's informative and important in understanding where we are and where we're going. So if I look back in time, business schools have been around only for a little less than a century and a half. University-based business education only dates back to the early 1880s. The Wharton School was the first business school created in the United States. And if you look at how that, kind of what the trajectory and evolution has been of business schools, it's been a very curious sort of Newton's third law phenomenon, where every action provokes an opposite and equal reaction. It's been very much ebbs and flow, periods of rapid growth and advance, followed by pushback, followed by retrenchment, followed by societal crisis and soul searching. and then another round. You know, it's sort of, there's elements of karma, there's elements of dialectic when you think about this as well. Polanyi described it as the double movement, right? Sort of the ebb and flow of the forces of economic liberalism and societal and social protection, or Galbraith's countervailing force. You know, that I think we see this dramatically illustrated. And perhaps most interestingly, Carl Jung's notion of the enantiodromia, which essentially means, you know, in psychology, but I think it's true societally as well, the tendency of things that reach an extreme to turn into their opposites. And I think that well describes how business education has evolved over the past century and, you know, basically 140 years. And there's been, you know, I think as an important piece of that, there's been kind of an internal struggle, almost like an ongoing identity crisis for business schools. And I think it looks something like this, that on the one hand, during certain periods of time, there's a logic of, think of it as vocationalism, right? That business education is all about jobs, placement, you know, kind of getting tooled up, getting my ticket punched, making sure that I get a return on my tuition. Very transactional, right? That it's really training. It's vocational training on the one hand. And on the other, the idea that there's a higher purpose involved here, that it's a calling, that it's a profession, that it's really about fulfillment and purpose and career development and impact, and acquiring the knowledge and skills and outlook in order to enable that to happen. A much more transformational agenda. And if we again look back over the past 140 years, it's been sort of an ebb and flow, push and pull between these two motivations, the transactional and the transformational. And I think we're in the midst of one of those again right now, which is where we'll end up. But first, let's look a little bit at where we've been. So if we think about the origins of business schools, it really came out of the Gilded Age, right? It was the result of pushback on, you know, the industrialists of the late 19th century, starting in the United States. You know, the tycoons of railroad and oil and steel fame and the financiers involved in that. There was rising social discontent, a growing kind of anarchist and labor movement, strikes that were unprecedented at that period of time. And it became evident to the capitalists at that time, you know, because it was such an uprooting of rural life and move to the city, factory work and so forth, as Karl Polanyi described, that they knew that it was not only important to have a form of education in order to develop those people who could manage these much larger industrial organizations, because prior to the latter half of the 19th century, companies were mainly sole proprietorships and much smaller. So yes, there was the need for kind of skills to manage large organizations, but equally important was the realization, you know, with the Wharton School and the Tuck School and Harvard Business School, all being founded in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that professionalization was crucial. This was Joseph Wharton's motivation, a fellow tycoon. And yes, it was about skill development, but importantly, it was about instilling a sense of social obligation to the greater good. That legitimacy was crucially important when it came to business education, because without it, these large corporations may well have problems, you know, remaining, right? And the industrialists realized that at the time. So legitimacy was a hugely important part of the original motivation for the creation of business schools in the first place. And this continued on, right, into the teens. There was an explosion of demand for business education after World War I, as you might expect. And so, you know, business schools maybe lost their way a little bit because the Roaring 20s were the Roaring 20s, and it kind of tilted more toward vocationalism. But then with the Great Depression came the soul searching once again. And you had the classic work of Adolf Berle and Gardner Means, you know, a classic work called The Modern Corporation and Private Property, where they established probably for the next 50 years, the principle of managerial primacy, that shareholders really take a back seat. In fact, they coined the phrase, the wages of capital, that it really ought to be principled managers that have society's best interest involved and understood. That was the driving force of thinking coming out of the 30s that carried over into the 50s, but with a very significant interruption called World War II, right? World War II, because AACSB was created in 1916 and was a driving force behind this kind of standardization, raising the bar when it came to business education. But World War II was a major discontinuity, as you might imagine. And coming out of the Second World War, AACSB took more of a back seat. That you had foundations and the federal government, right? The federal government, in winning the war, you saw the blossoming of fields like linear programming and systems analysis and queuing theory and statistical methods and survey methodology were crucial in the war effort, but also became very important in thinking about business education, applying those tools from the war to the large corporations that emerged from the Second World War as the world dominant players. That was the case given the destruction in Europe and Japan. And you had the federal government play an important role with returning GIs, many of them needing training in business education for jobs in these very same industries. And the Ford and Carnegie foundations came to the fore as important motive forces and shaping forces in business education. You had the founders, Ford and Carnegie pass on, leaving a fortune to these foundations. They were flush with cash, and their focus really was on business education. And at the time, the sorry state, in their view, of sort of a weak foundation, that professors were not well trained, that many of the students were unqualified, that they were not particularly research driven. And so they took it upon themselves to become a shaping force by putting significant money up to, sort of quantify, to mechanize, to bring these tools of management science to fore and embed them in the business school curriculum, which is what happened starting in the 60s and carrying on into the 70s. It was really the beginning of what we think of as the core curriculum now, which has, maybe somewhat tragically remained almost unchanged with some, reform around the edges. Now, since the 60s and 70s, this is what really drove the kind of the modern business school as we know it, the very critical Ford and Carnegie reports and the application of these kind of quantitative methods. It was also the time when economics really rose to the fore, became in some sense the dominant discipline in business schools. Yes, the social sciences also were significantly advanced with the Second World War and the advent of survey methods and the development of survey methods. But the, sort of the neoclassical economic paradigm really did reign supreme, the ultimate in quantification, and became the dominant perspective. Now, this carried over into the 70s, of course, and set the tone for what I sort of think of as the takeover of business schools during the 80s by the finance and economics faculties. The 70s was a period of, as many might recall, of sort of a lost decade. Flat stock market, the oil embargo, the oil crisis, stagflation in the United States, that set the stage for the neoliberalist agenda to really rise to the fore. Milton Friedman's piece in 1970 being a crucial piece of that thinking, kind of the Friedman doctrine of maximizing profits and then the logic of shareholder primacy. And in some sense, what it amounts to is a repudiation of professionalism, right? The idea that, especially as we moved on from the Mont Pelerin Society and Hayek, Friedman became the president of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1970, to a much more academically grounded way of thinking about this, with agency theory, right, and efficient markets and so forth. There was a logic now for why share price was the defining feature, for why quarterly earnings were so important, for why we should embed executive compensation in share price, for why we should think about, these managers as self-interested players, without that. So the idea of managerial primacy was flipped, right? That this is now the age of shareholder primacy. The assumption is managers are selfish, self-interested individual actors, and they don't have the shareholders in mind. And so now suddenly you have a well-grounded theory that's quantifiable, that drives kind of the research agenda during this period of time, and in some sense overturns the logic from the 30s of professionalism. It's almost a delegitimation of judgment, right? And becomes much more of a single objective function of share price. And of course, this is the philosophy that has driven business schools now since the 80s. When I came, I joined the faculty at the University of Michigan in 1985 in the business school teaching strategy in 1985. And now as I think back on it retrospectively, I witnessed that change, that takeover. There were still many faculty in the mid 80s that were steeped in the earlier perspective of managerial primacy, but in fairly short order, most of them were retired, I guess would be the polite way of putting it. And the perspectives that I'm describing here really became the dominant perspectives. Now, we've seen what's happened, right? For the 30 plus years of financial capitalism has yes, there have been some successes to be sure, right? Over that period of time, we had especially the rise of China. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of extreme poverty during that period of time. There can be no question about that. But we've also seen, the growth of toxic inequality over the world. The climate crisis is upon us, ecosystem degradation on a scale that we've not witnessed before, and a real questioning now of the logic of shareholder primacy, of short-termism, as was mentioned earlier. And so I think we're at very much of a tipping point as we speak. And I think that one of the best articulations of this comes from a book that I'll mention in a moment. But we see many countervailing forces that have arisen over the last, say, 20, 30 years. I've jotted a few of them down here. Many of you probably recognize these they're somewhat tribal, the buzzwords people kind of affiliate with different perspectives. But at root, they're all driven by the same recognition that, the dominant perspective of shareholder primacy and market fundamentalism isn't working. And this is part of the countervailing force, part of the double movement that over the last 30 years has gained momentum and picked up significant strength. And, and I think if you're interested in a book that brings to life and tells the story of the evolution of business schools over the last 140 years, I would highly recommend Rakesh Khurana's book, From Higher Aims to Hired Hands. But I think now the important question is not so much how we got to where we are, but what are the implications of that for where we're going and more importantly, where we need to go. Have we reached a point, are we at a similar point to where business schools were back at their inception in the late 19th century, when it became obvious to the capitalists themselves that legitimation was crucial? The embedding of sense of social purpose, of business for the greater good, was crucial to the continued survival of business, at least in the form that existed back then, the large industrial corporations. Are we at a similar point again today? And I think in many respects, the answer to that is yes, right? And we've seen lots and lots of books, Can American Capitalism Survive? And many of you know Lynn Stout's work on the shareholder value myth, which really counters agency theory in a very, I think, serious and well thought out way. And of course, we've seen the rise of many other movements, Prime included, importantly kind of pushing back, providing a counter narrative, providing an impetus to think about reform, right, in business education. And reform is important, in some ways it's provided a veneer of legitimacy, right, that we've seen these kinds of reforms begin to occur in terms of programs, and I'll say more about that in a few moments. But, I believe we really are at a tipping point, that capitalism really is at a crossroads as we sit here today, importantly so. And, for me personally, this has been an interesting kind of evolution as well. I feel like I've been living the double movement, if you will, as Polanyi described it, at least helping to create some of the counter narrative. I was at the University of Michigan for a long time and involved in the creation of what's now known as the Herb Dual Masters Program. Back then it was called the Corporate Environmental Management Program, dual degree between the business school and the School of Natural Resources and Environment. I was at UNC and helped to found the Center for Sustainable Enterprise there. And then at Cornell for 10 years, creating another center called the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise. And as important as this work is, and all of these still exist, and I think it continue to do really important work, they really are in a sense a veneer, right? Because the rest of the school and the core curriculum has continued on pretty much unabated. And I'll say more about that in a moment. And so, I sort of reached a point where, my conclusion of where we were and where we are is that, for you Game of Thrones fans, winter is coming, right? That for business education, business as usual, and capitalism as we've known it for the last 30 years, I think we're at a tipping point. That it just simply can't continue. That for business education, I think it's going to be either slow death or deep change. And that's probably appropriate because of, when you think about it, the centrality of business education in creating the current predicament that we're in allowing shareholder primacy to dominate business education for the last 30 or 40 years. We need transformational change, not just adjustment around the edge, not just veneers of legitimacy, but fundamental change. And that's what I want to talk about for the time remaining today. That's been the project that I've been engaged in personally for the last 7 or 8 years. It started, as I say, 7 or 8 years ago at the University of Vermont, where a new dean came in, now going on 10 years ago, a guy named Sanjay Sharma that many of you know, who shared this vision. And we, along with a lot of other faculty colleagues and corporate and business partners, have been able to mount something beyond what we would think of as saddlebag sustainability. That so much of what has passed for the countervailing movement has been like saddlebags hanging off the side of a horse, right? That they look great from the outside, they're visible from the outside, you can open them up and there's cool stuff inside. But you can always take these centers or institutes or programs off and it's the same old horse, right? It's that the fundamental, the core of business education hasn't really changed much in the last 35 or 40 years. So this was our project. This was our rather audacious goal in creating the Sustainable Innovation MBA program at the University of Vermont, which I say started now in earnest 8 years back, where the dean was able to abolish the MBA program that was there, which was shrinking and losing money. So he didn't get that much pushback. And we were able then to start with a clean sheet of paper and ask ourselves the question, what should business education look like going forward? What should 21st century business education look like? Realizing that, the predicament that we were in and, increasingly understanding and benefiting from history, right? How things, that shareholder primacy is not forever. This is just the last 30 or 40 years. There have been many other versions of business education prior to that. And it's time for us to think creatively how to get to what comes next. So our mission for the Sustainable Innovation MBA program is to reinvent business education, to develop and launch a new generation of leaders who will transform capitalism to solve the world's most pressing sustainability challenges. And, we've been moderately successful in achieving that. The Grossman School's SIMBA program now has established itself as the #1 Better World MBA program, which is a corporate Knights ranking that some of you may know. We tend not to pay attention to, the Business Week or US News and World Report or Fortune rankings, which are all about the money and how much money graduates make. Not that we're against money, we're not against money. But we don't think that the purpose of business education ought to just be vocation, job, and money. That tilts to that, to the left side of that ledger that I showed you earlier. We think that it's time for business education once again to restore a sense of purpose, to restore a sense of calling, to restore a sense of true legitimacy of the role of business in the world. And that's what we've tried to do, right, in creating the SIMBA program. So we think of it as an MBA for the 21st century. How have we done this? What does it look like? Well, of course, it still has the core MBA toolkit. It must, right? You must have a core set of skills and knowledge about a core set of functional skills, but we approach this in a decidedly critical way, right? Rather than just articulating these courses, these functional courses, as indoctrination and training, it's all about learning them because you must understand what's underneath them, but approach them critically. What are the toxic side effects of blindly applying many of the tools and methods that have come out of the functions? And what's missing, importantly, what's missing? So we approach, as you'll see in a moment, even what we think of as the more traditional functional courses that way. And this is a 12-month program, and we're going to add more content, right, that we'll think of as the SIMBA difference. So the question is, how do we do all that in 12 months? And the only way to do that is to actually remove some of the legacy content. Now, for those of you that have taught in MBA programs for a long time, you understand that there is a lot of legacy content in MBA programs that have been around for a long time. That's unsurprising, right? That content gets embedded in, becomes part of faculty teaching loads. The motivation is to do research and publish, to minimize the amount of new prep. So it should be unsurprising that there's a lot of inertia around MBA content. And it's tough to change that, to reform it when you're just doing innovation around the edge. But we had the opportunity to start with a clean sheet of paper. It's like zero-based budgeting. We could look critically at everything that was there and make some conscious choices about what to leave out, right? Which is typically not possible when you're doing more reformist kind of work with existing MBA programs. So just as an example, in many MBA programs still, there are 2 or 3 weeks of queuing theory, right, in like the core ops course. Not to denigrate queuing theory, it's very important. But is it really necessary to devote 2 or 3 weeks with hand calculations? Probably not. Does an MBA need to know what queuing theory is and what it's good for? Yes, and where to go if that becomes a serious issue for them? Absolutely, but that's probably something that can be taught in 15 or 20 minutes. And the same is true with many other areas that are, that still occupy significant space in the MBA curriculum. So we've been able to kind of, because we started with a clean sheet, remove or minimize a lot of the vestigial content. It's like the appendix, that there's really no need for that to still be there, even though it is. And in its place, have inserted a lot of new content. As I say, there's the critical approach to the functions themselves, but we also bring a lot of new content that you wouldn't typically find in an MBA program that's core, right? That's core to the program. Whether it's the SDGs or planetary boundaries or circularity, or climate innovation or biomimicry, or how to approach inequality, how to think about inclusive business, how to engage in deep dialogue, how to practice empathy, how to think about appreciative inquiry. These are all crucial elements of our Sustainable Innovation MBA program because we think they're essential to successful business in the future. To the leaders of business in the future, these are core skills in our view. So it's a very busy 1 year. There are 24 courses over 4 8-week modules. It's a 45 credit hour MBA. It is an MBA degree. It's AACSB accredited. We embed a lot of teamwork training, a lot of leadership development and skills workshops. And then the capstone in the final 3 months, all the coursework is done in 8 months, 8 to 9 months. And then we have a practicum project, which is a full-time capstone practicum project, applying this in a real world setting. Then, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, a fair amount of time focused around career mentoring with innovators and residents from the real world and development in terms of career thinking. And I'll speak to that a little bit more. So just to give you a quick view, I realize this is a bit of an eye test, but thought I would show you what the actual curriculum is, right? And you can see the courses without the blue dots would be courses, that they would be more functionally oriented that you would typically find in business schools and MBAs. But as you can see, these are very much taught from the perspective of sustainability and inclusion, whether it's business strategy for a sustainable world or sustainable operations and green supply chains. the functional courses are taught, from that perspective. Then we have a number of other courses, as I mentioned before, with where you can see with the blue dots, that you typically would not find in MBA programs. And these are core to the program. This is the SIMBA curriculum. There are no elective courses. Everything is core. This is like a boot camp experience for the students. It's drinking out of a fire hose. It's an extreme bonding kind of program because all this coursework is done in 9 months with the capstone practicum project at its conclusion. And a week later, the students graduate. So, in kind of thinking about the program, we realized that yes, the curriculum is a key part of this, right? We think of this as the develop part of the SIMBA process, the actual kind of building of the sustainable innovation knowledge, tools, and capabilities. That preoccupied us deeply, as you might imagine, the first couple of years. That's pretty much all you're focused on. But it became apparent rather rapidly that if we were going to be successful, we had to figure out how to identify and attract the right students, right? That this is a very different looking MBA. And so it took us some time to figure out how to communicate about the program and to identify where are the deep wells of prospective students for a program like this. And one of the things we realized was that many of the students who are most interested and who end up coming to our program aren't necessarily those that were thinking about MBA at all in the first place. In other words, we're not competing with the incumbent MBA program so much for students. We're actually opening up new ballrooms of prospective students. These might be people who are thinking about graduate school. They knew they wanted to do something positive in the world. Maybe it was public health, or maybe it was environment school, or public policy, or law school, what have you. But when they became aware of our program, it changed their thinking, and they realized that this was a pathway. That purpose-driven, sustainability-oriented business was a viable pathway, and so this sort of attract piece of it, obviously crucial if you're going to bring the right people into a purpose-driven business program like ours. But then, even more importantly, we realized that on the back end, if all we did was try to bolt on a conventional MBA placement office, not only would it be disingenuous, but it just wouldn't work. I mean, those companies and that recruitment process is geared toward the existing top 20 MBA programs, not a program like ours, which is not in the conventional top 20. It is #1 in the corporate Knights ranking. So we've spent the last probably 3 or 4 years really thinking through an alternative structure we call launch, not placement, enabling students from the very beginning, because it's a 12-month program, first to sort of figure out who their best self is, for them to kind of self-discover, what's their North Star, and then to, as quickly as possible, identify what's the immediate next step they want to take after business school. And then to work to skill them up in terms of informational interviewing and networking, and then to actually get them in touch, in a network. So we've tried to build a robust network we call a Changemaker network from Ashoka's part of our network. So they allow us to borrow that term, of people out there in the world of practice, in corporate transformation, in purpose-driven business, in clean tech venturing, in inclusive business, in sustainable finance and impact investing, in the NGO world that view business as a vehicle for change, because those are the places we think we really prepare people for, and have over the last 3 or 4 years developed a new process we call launch rather than placement, which we think is crucial to long-term success for a program like this. And that's how we really have impact, because our ultimate intent is to have positive impact out there in the world. So another way to think about this, in terms of placement versus launch, on the horizontal axis, you have, sort of organizational life cycle. There's startup ventures, there are established firms, there are those that are going through, perhaps some of their businesses have reached the end of their life cycle, so they're looking to change. And then on the vertical axis, you can think about more traditional MBA jobs, which are all about functional execution, right? That the recruiters are there to hire people in marketing and finance and operations and consulting, in corporations, in banks, in consulting firms. And it's all about executing on current strategy as much as any. So in a sense, it perpetuates the status quo. Whereas we think about SIMBA roles more as change makers. So our focus when it comes to launch is on kind of in the startup side, you know, kind of thinking about as an entrepreneur, getting engaged with entrepreneurs that are innovating, that are creating new business models in the clean tech, regenerative tech space, in inclusive and base of the pyramid business, and the investing, right, in terms of sustainable finance and impact investing that goes with that underpins that underlies it. And then on the other end, you know, those existing corporations that are looking to transform, to generate new experiments, new business models inside their own firms in the same sort of clean regenerative tech space and an inclusive base of the pyramid business, and the consulting that goes along with that. So we see those as sort of our sweet spots, you know, where yes, they have to understand the world of the implementer, and in some cases may take jobs in those places that the companies themselves want to bring change agents into conventional functions with an eye towards transforming them. So this has been the way we've tried to think this through and how we've oriented the program, and then how we try to build a launch function rather than traditional placement. So we think that there's a unique value proposition here, at least for starters, because unless you can kind of make a case and stand the program up, you don't have anything. So you've heard a bit about the curriculum, and you know, we're accredited by AACSB. That was actually quite a smooth process. It was not, we didn't get pushback at all. In fact, our examiners told us they had wished that more business schools were creating programs like ours. Have developed this launch system. It's a one-year program, so only 1 year of opportunity cost, you know, 9 months of extensive in-residence experience and 3 months capstone, as I've said. And then lastly, and I think equally importantly, we took it upon ourselves to just unilaterally, dramatically reduce tuition. That, you know, University of Vermont is a state school. So in state for the degree, it's low 30s, around 32,000 right now. Out of state for the degree is the low 50s, right? So students graduate with a car loan rather than a home mortgage, which allows them to have more flexibility in terms of thinking about their next steps, right? They don't become slaves to debt service, which gives them a lot more flexibility when they think about launch. In some cases, that might mean taking a series of project experiences in order to gain experience rather than needing to have a high-paying full-time job right out of business school. And we view that as positive, right? We're not evaluating ourselves solely on how much money our graduates make. So I think this combination of factors is quite important. So just to close, I think this idea of the next capitalist reformation, extremely important, because I think we're in the throes of that. It's happening, right? We can already begin to see it out there in the world. You know, whether it's the Larry Finks of the world or the extensive kind of innovations that are occurring within corporations, collaboration around climate, around poverty, around smallholder farmers, around sustainable ag and food, around circularity. It's happening out there. So we think business education needs to join the party and to not be purely reactive, but get out in front and lead. Right? So how can business and capitalism be redesigned to include, serve, and lift the underserved, and simultaneously conserve and replenish the natural capital that supports all life on Earth, and make money doing it? That's really the key. And that means to involve ourselves in the enterprise of creative destruction. That it's not about just the SIMBA program at Vermont. We need to be thinking about creatively destroying the entire industry. That in the coming years, business education needs to be transformed. That starts with all of us, right? It's going to come from the bottom up. It's going to be Christiansonian disruption. So I think it isn't necessarily the top 20 incumbent MBA programs that are going to lead. It's going to be the hundreds and hundreds of others, many of which are, you know, that the changes that are occurring are already existential threats, where we have an opportunity to be innovators, to really step out and participate in this process of creative destruction. So just to close, you know, I think the challenge is the scale, right? How do we scale this and really participate in a wide scale innovation beyond just the Grossman School? We must create a larger initiative to do this. And to me, this is what Prime, you know, is all about, should be all about, needs to be all about, right? How do we rise to this challenge? How can Prime become a driving force of this transformation of business education, not just kind of innovation around the edge for reform? So let me stop there. Thank you all.
Thank you, Stu. That was fantastic history and bringing us up to the present. We have a few questions. If you look at the Q&A, you'll see them. So I'm going to start with the last question from my partner, Mike Barnett, the academic director for the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. And he says, hi, Stu. The big challenges of this are faculty inertia and student employability. Can you please provide some details on how you overcame faculty resistance and the employment outcomes for students?
Yeah, he's exactly right, of course. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, there's a certain, each school's different, right? Sort of where each school starts is somewhat different. So I can tell the story of how it happened for us at the University of Vermont in the business school there. And this is another reason why I think in some ways it'll be, you know, what we might think of as the second tier schools that have the best chance of doing this. You know, because I lived most of my career in the tier one, you know, I was at Michigan and UNC and Cornell. So I know what that world is like. And part of the reason that there's so much resistance in places like that is because the faculty are, they've been so rich in resources, right? That they're fully funded, summer support, you know, all kinds of, you know, travel money, you know, it's really been Fat City. I hate to say it, but it has, right? And then that reduces motivation to change, right? That you have faculty then also have developed a comfort level in terms of their teaching load. They don't want to change it. But when you're in a second tier school, it isn't necessarily that easy, right? That the schools that are more resource constrained, maybe that don't have as much summer support, that don't have as much research money and travel money, there's a little more openness to think about how the school might innovate in order to improve their position, right? So they're more hungry, I guess would be the way to put it. And so that was certainly our experience, I think, you know, at Vermont, was that we didn't encounter anywhere near the same kind of resistance that you would get, you know, at the top tier incumbent schools. In fact, there was kind of an interest and openness even among the finance faculty. That was the case. And, you know, and we were then able to assemble a multifunctional team in thinking through what the structure of this curriculum should look like. And it also reached out beyond the business school, because the truth is when we started, there weren't faculty that could populate all those courses that I showed you. So in the early going, a number of the faculty that taught in the MBA program were not business school faculty. They were faculty at Vermont, but they weren't in the business school. And that brought kind of interesting perspectives to bear too. And we did some, you know, things like storyboarding of courses and programs so that everyone could see what everyone else's content was. And it served to kind of help kind of open people's minds and open people's thinking. And then as the program took root and became, you know, more recognized, it was a vehicle for recruiting new faculty, right? So one of the things we found was over the last 6 or 7 years, I mean, it's a small school to start with, right? There's 40 full-time faculty. But the success of the SIMBA program helped to attract faculty who probably wouldn't have thought about coming to Vermont previously. They could have competed for jobs, you know, in tier 1 schools, in many cases research active, but decided they happen to be faculty whose research agenda was in sustainability and purpose and so forth. And they saw Vermont as the kind of place where they could have colleagues who had the same interest, where they could have teaching load in a program like SIMBA, and that was attractive to them. And so over the last 6 or 7 years, we've been able to recruit, you know, 6 or 7 new faculty off a base of 40, right? It was still about, I'd say the net increase is maybe 2 or 3 faculty, but there's been turnover. And we've hired several new faculty, all of whom, or pretty much all of whom, came because of their interest in this area and the opportunity to teach in the SIMBA program. So it's served as an attractor, and I think has helped to kind of embed this in the school's culture And then that's in turn allowed us then to bring more and more of this content into the undergraduate program, which is also being transformed. But that's a much slower process because it's much bigger, right? That's 1,000 students. The MBA program is still small, but because it's small, it allowed us to really turn that to fundamentally transform it. It's tough to fundamentally transform a program with 1,000 students, right? That's more like a tanker, turning a tanker. But having the SIMBA program as our leverage point has allowed the kind of the building of this culture and faculty that I've just described, and then that in turn influences the undergraduate program.
Okay, so we had the second part of Mike's question on the employment outcomes for students, and a related question from Nirma, who said, who are the companies recruiting from this SIMBA program, and what is the success rate of student placement?
Yeah, so this comes back to the idea of launch versus placement, right? So, and this is still, full disclosure, a work in progress, right? So I'll be brutally honest. In the early going, we were pretty bad, right? I mean, there was so much focus on the curricular innovation, as you might imagine. It was a completely new program from scratch. So the first year or two, we weren't able to focus a whole lot on the back end, right? On what we're now calling launch. Yeah, I mean, we were able to kind of bring in the usual suspects in Vermont, Ben & Jerry's and Seventh Generation and Becton and, and Cabot and Native Energy. And so there's an ecosystem of these kinds of companies in Vermont. Then, we're also able to attract some larger corporations, more global companies, that got involved too, even in the early going. Practicum has helped us a lot with that because we're able to structure projects in these organizations that then in some cases lead to work opportunities, to continuing opportunities beyond the practicums themselves. But it's really been just in the last 3 or 4 years as the curriculum is really, we've been able to stand it up, and now that's in more of a continuous improvement mode, that we've been able to focus, kind of fully on launch. And to be honest with you, what it takes is building as big a network of practitioners who share this DNA as you can, right? So rather than the conventional recruiter approach, which is locked up by the top 20 schools, we can still go to some of those corporations, the PepsiCos and Unilevers and others, but you establish different routes in, right? You build relationships with people in those companies who share this view about business. And they're the ones that network you into a smaller number. In other words, it's not a routinized placement machine. It's a more customized kind of set of relationships. And we now have, well over 100 people in the world of practice that have agreed to be part of our SIMBA Changemaker network, which means they're willing to spend time with our students. In some cases, they'll do, informational interviews. They'll do a session with the students. But, at a minimum, take phone calls, answer emails, provide referrals, give inreach into their company, be career mentors. And so we view launch, as sort of an organized networking exercise. That's really what it is. And yes, there are some, kind of fully baked jobs that are out there and we obviously the more of those, the better. But in many cases, our graduates are not ending up landing, defined jobs. That part of this is building a culture around the MBA program of being a creator and a hunter and an entrepreneur, not a passive recipient of jobs. I mean, I think this has been one of the aspects of the 80s version of business school, which is I'm coming to get my ticket punched and get tooled up so that I job offers land in my lap that pay 150K, right? I think that's where we've been. I don't think that's where we can be going. So where we're going, I think, is the creation of a more entrepreneurial student culture, where even in those business schools now, right, in the incumbent schools, the students that have this interest, that's how they think, right? They realize that the recruitment process isn't going to get them to where they want to be. They have to kind of think more in a more entrepreneurial way outside of that system. For us, that's our whole program, right? So we have, I suppose, the opportunity to actually try to structure and build an organized approach to launch rather than just leaving it up to the students to figure out, with whatever help we can give them. So that's been what we've been up to, is trying to actually build a structured program called Launch, which includes kind of working with them, kind of assessments and counseling to help them figure out where they want to go. And then this organized networking process through the Changemaker Network down avenues of change that we think we prepare people for: corporate transformation, purpose-driven business, clean tech venturing, inclusive venturing, sustainable finance and impact investing, and populate, our program with practitioners in that space.
Great. We're just about out of time, and we have a number of more questions. So I'm going to fire a few of them at you for quick answers. Someone asked, Giselle asked, is the MBA program online?
Yes and no, right? So prior to COVID, no. It was a purely residential program, and that was one of its strengths, was that it's a very personal, intense, face-to-face experience, like a boot camp, which creates strong bonds between the faculty and the students that last. And so we have now six cohorts of graduates. We stay in touch with all of them, right? I mean, so it's a pretty tight group, as you might imagine. Now, COVID has forced us, just like a lot of other programs, to adopt more of a hybrid approach. Although I'll have to say, even this year, our group of students are on campus at the University of Vermont. Vermont is less hit by COVID than a lot of other parts of the U.S. So the students are there in residence, but some of the classes are being taught online. And so we view that as perhaps a pathway toward offering an online version of the program. But what we do have is, and it's spun out of the university, is an actual online certificate program called Leading the Sustainability Transformation. It's an 8-week online, fully online, virtual, synchronous and asynchronous program. And if you Google Leading the Sustainability Transformation, it's being run by an outfit called Whole Works. And so that exists as a badge certificate program that spun out from our SIMBA program.
Okay. We had a couple more questions, and then we have to move on. So thank you for this inspiring presentation from Suzanne Ritter von Marx. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you attract students? What are your experiences here? Which are the best and fruitful ways to attract students? How do you get in contact with them? Thank you.
Yeah. And it isn't necessarily so easy, right? And so in the beginning, when you're starting from scratch, so the University of Vermont, as a business school and as an MBA program, did not have much of a reputation 8 years ago. It was more of a local, regional evening MBA program for, like IBMers. Burlington used to have a strong IBM presence that shrunk. That's one of the reasons why the MBA program shrunk. So when we started, we were starting from almost no reputational base, which isn't necessarily bad, because at least we didn't have a bad reputation, right? It's just that nobody had really ever heard of the place. So we spent a fair amount of time, kind of going, on the road a bit, right? So net impact was important, right? In beginning to at least communicate about the existence of the program. And, there are various other kind of graduate school recruitment events, that are also geared toward graduate students that have, sort of positive social impact as their primary motivation. The people returning from the Peace Corps turn out to be a very interesting audience to appeal to as well. And it's possible to get your message in front of those. So we spent a lot of time kind of searching for venues where we knew were populated by people that were potentially interested in graduate school and were motivated by making positive contributions out there in the world. And then also doing a fair amount of digital marketing, right? So it's possible to do a lot more targeted digital marketing these days, and even more now than 7 or 8 years ago. And then, as you stand up, and you have to be willing to lose money for a few years. Right, so we started with 20 students, right, and that obviously loses money. It took us 5 years to get to the point where we broke even. So that requires leadership that's willing to stay with it, that's willing to underwrite it for a period of time until you build enough reputation and word of mouth out there. We're at a point now where I think we've I hate to say we're established, but there's enough, there's enough reputation, enough knowledge that the applications, it's interesting that the number of applicants, we had 2.5 times the number of applicants this year as we did last year. Now, a lot of that's COVID,
Wow.
right? But even before that, we were, it was kind of 20–30% growth in applications year over year. Compare that to the conventional MBA, which is seeing declining number of applications. So we think we're doing something right and probably in a growth space rather than in a declining space.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. A couple of people are asking if you're willing to share the slides. I know we're going to post the recording.
Yeah, what I can do, Jeana, is I can make a PDF and send it to you.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Stuart. Let's applaud. I think there's a way to clap on here. Fabulous presentation. Thank you so much, Stuart.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you.